It is essential that all sacred scriptures be fully translated and available with commentaries of both the mundane sort and of the sort more relevant to the devotees who are practitioners of the sacred text. The sacred texts of India are called the Vedas. These Vedas, at least in some references, were all said to have been originally written and taught by Vyasadeva. And for this reason, this vassal of the light beings has been treated as an incarnation of God. To some degree, we see that as something that was done with Ezra, but the Son of God stuff there was just almost entirely a phrase. But people did worship through that. And in the Srimad Bhagavatam, it's obviously Parikshit and Sukadeva Goswami are later. We can well establish that at this point. And it has a focus on bhakti, which is the divine love, the service out of love. Now, some people say that love is in 5 stages. You got the servant master, you got the friend, you got the parent-child, you got the spousal, and you got the socially inappropriate level of love. Certainly, you got to, build your way up to really be on the higher stages. You can't just skip to being socially inappropriate and that's it, right? Because so many people will treat it like that, right? And by putting material on my channel, I feel that I'm reaching people in a way that perhaps they wouldn't otherwise be reached. And so there's an importance of what it does to my mind and your mind. And I am presenting what I'm doing here as a, what I'm doing is it's a spiritual practice. One verse in the Bhagavatam, Canto 7, Chapter 6, Verse 1, Kaumara acharet prajno dharman bhagavatan neha durlabham manusham janma tadape adruvam arthadam. And so the issues that happen in society are because of principles that are outside of reference to the personality of God. And this God is almightily one. People say the Bhagavatam is a monist text. The source of all and the container of all. And the materialists, they try to find this source, but they don't quite have it. Another text that we would look at is Canto 1, Chapter 5, Verse 11. Tadvag visargo janataga viplavo Yasmin prate slokam abadavate ape namane anantasya yaso ketaneyach charnbande gayante granande sadava. An exception is the literature that is full of reference to the transcendence with the name, the fame, the form, and activities of the Supreme Lord, and as such is a transcendental creation with the purpose of bringing the impious to a cause of revolution, and even though there may be irregularities in their transmission, they're heard and accepted for the purpose of honesty. And the 10th canto is different from the first 9 because it's purely about the activities of who's known as Krishna. And some say you have to read the first 9 to get the effects of the first one. And such texts as this are supposed to be ones that will protect you from atheism and practical atheism. Now, I don't know if I've ever talked to an atheist. I've talked to a lot of people that would have said they're atheist, but it's just they didn't want to accept the spiritual path, or they didn't believe in the sort of hierarchy that you learn about in church or something, right? It wasn't actually, most of them, it wasn't even, the idea of a God that they were rebelling against. Now, affecting their own behavior, that's a different story. They wanted to do stuff that, those 5 pillars of sinful life, right? Or, 4 pillars of sinful life, more commonly called. And if there's the base and the spiritualness, the social structure follows. It's like people who get married for selfish reasons, it ends up being a problem later on, because they're no longer going to do these things when the other one is sick or something. And those little lapses add up to big problems over time. And that goes with all sorts of human relations. And one of the things about having scripture is that, as indicated in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 3, verse 43, is that it remains a brilliancy, even when there's the departure, because the sent ones aren't always on earth, or they're not always accessible like that, but what they were sent with remains. Now, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness and most groups that you would call Hindu, although Hindu is not really an appropriate term for religion, they do what's called fanaticism, because they take the teachers, particularly the 24 so-called incarnations, instead of the teachings. Well, they take the teachings, but you know what I mean. The focus is on the worship. Just like a Christian worships Jesus, and that's technically what's meant by fanaticism. And but they're not ashamed of it. They'll be embarrassed because they're going around whatever. If people are going to make a deal like that, it's become more normal in society than it was before I was born. But although you no longer can go to an airport and find some random Vaishnavi, And it puts forth an idealism of a world kingdom under the sent spiritual principles. So, a kingdom that upholds the various justices, a kingdom that is open to philosophical discussions and all sorts of expression of religion. And it helps to have an idea of different civilizations. And some of these texts, even if they're just representative, they represent the societies of old. They represent the spiritual experiences that happen to those societies. And so we have a picture of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, the founder, Acharya of the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. It looks like he has a brass cup and a bell, and he wears a ring on his left hand. Was he married and he left his ring on when he went into all this? He wears orange, and he has a top wrap on over that, so it must not have been completely hot. And then we have one with this big old bird, presumably Garuda, and this big old bird. They're playing musical instruments. They're having a trail of flowers that the couple is walking on. They're kind of overshadowed by the presence of all these beings. So when you get married, you're definitely enacting a sort of mythology, as you could say, or connecting yourself to a mythology. Otherwise, it's technically a civil union if you're just, I don't believe in secular marriage, I've made that point before. And then we have one where there's a rainbow, but underneath it is the clouds in the night. So we have the stages of the environment and the day and the individual sort of represented there. And we do have a temple setting. And that another way of looking at it is the temple setting holds up the night, and then the night turns into the day, and then the joys happen, or you have the very physical / mental arrangement, and that opens up into the feeling and the emotions of it all, which of course spreads wider into spirit. And another illustration that we got is, divine death with a necklace of skulls, telling of a sacrifice to occur at her father's place, are telling us something to come. And she's like, really? And he's like, and he's very calm and smooth about what's going to happen. Now there's more to the things, and then there's a big canopy. The woman's in the middle, but the woman's on fire, so she's committing suicide before everybody. And so she meditated herself into, okay, that's where it could have all came from, is that you put yourself into a state. There is fiery states that you get into mystically. Of course, the story is that then she burned herself to death, that aren't harmful. Now there are unpleasant things that can happen medically or whatever that's not quite along those lines. And we have another illustration. In this other illustration, the aura around the chief male and the chief female in this gathering is not quite the same. She is the musician, so you can say the music represents the tones of the voice, perhaps, and the garland of the weapon of the unconscious. But you're out in the forest, and I don't know, I feel like doing more of my Hindu playlist videos outside in the forest is an important thing to do. And so we have sort of a family scene, but you get the impression that this palace family scene is not just family, but there's an attendant too. And so it seems to be, the woman is arguing. Or perhaps she's arguing with her husband, and the other person's like her brother, and it's like, okay, let me take the kids, let me aside while you have your discussion here. And there's certain idols above, and maybe these female idols, which aren't exactly the same. The two below kind of, the one above, they're kind of, and there's other smaller ones. So maybe there's some significance with that. The parasol seems to be for decoration. We have another one of a mother and a little girl, and another on the riverbank. And then as a young woman serving the king, so, her stages of life until she's moved on to the next one. But this is put in the context of a stepping aside, a sort of wilderness of it all. And Prabhupada went around the earth 12 times with his lectures on 6 continents in his last decade, or the decade 1964 to 1974, I guess. And the lectures are recordings that I haven't talked about. I plan to go through them and make comments about all of them. Not an extensive commentary where I'm back and forth with everything, but certainly I'm going to share what I think is important as time goes on. Okay, so yeah, 1962 to 72. And as of 1977, okay, so it's 1967, 1977, there were 20 Gurukula schools, and so these were children's schools with at least a side note where they teach the International Society of Krishna Consciousness path. And there's other things about his life, but we can maybe get into some of that later. So we have the descendants of the daughters of Sva Yambuva Manu. So Sva Yambuva Manu and his children Uttanapada, Priyavrata, Akute, and Rucha, Devahuta, and Kardama, and Prasuta, and Daksha. Okay, so for the first two we have sort of incomplete reference. But I don't think it's appropriate for me to go through them all here. You're going to hear some names as you go on. So the marriage ties. So Rucha was married, Kardama's married, Daksha's married. And so by marriage and lineage, you explain not only the theology, but the kingship of it all. Some will say that greater than anything that you could personally do as far as a philosophical work is to translate a scripture. And the greatest of philosophical works would be the direct and authoritative commentaries on it thereof. Because let us remember that philosophy is not quoting philosophers. If you quote philosophers, you're not doing philosophy. You're just replacing religion with that sort of thing. And that's why there's so much talk against mainstream philosophy in certain religions, like the ones that you consider Vedic religions, and in the Bible. There's an absolute banning of philosophy after Paul and his buddies that wrote the Bible. The Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavata Purana, is 18,000 verses. And I don't know if it's exact, because they do list exact for some of the chapters, but 18,000 is the number that you keep running into. And one thing that helps is to actually do the pilgrimages and some of the things mentioned in the text, whether they're obliged or just indicated as a good idea. It gives you a sense and experience of these things. And as far as formal initiation, Prabhupada took 11 years after deciding to be dedicated to teaching about the Vedas that he became a formal student. So, you need to leave things open for people to accept and practice as they go along. Certainly, whether I'm doing a short ritual or a long ritual, or doing a study or whatever, whoever decides to join, whoever doesn't decide to join. Some compromises for attending a group, but not compromises in terms of, the religion that each is on. I allow for that. If people aren't going to pray, if there's even a few people or whatever, and they've obliged themselves towards a ritual, it's like, okay, I'll eat it, and they're like, but they don't want to, and it's not because, they wanted to be the one leading. It's like, okay, if you know more of it than I do, then go ahead. And the 64 Gaudiya Matas, so these institutes were established by the predecessor, Saraswati, of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. And so, he ended up outdoing that, but that's not the point. It's just to spread it as much as you can. And certainly you get credit for the spreading as you go along.